The Resident Evil franchise has had a clear and profound impact not only on the survival horror genre, but the gaming industry in itself. With Capcom's recent success over the years, they have created an establishment for themselves that even though this franchise is 3 decades old, it can still come out with bangers that millions of people across the globe will cherish playing, and definitely not edge on. This success has been attributed to Capcom's impressive ambitions and game design. After all, they are the kings of remakes. They are the sole reason everyone is remaking old games. It is rare for a franchise as old as Resident Evil to be this popular still and consistent throughout the different console generations and eras of gaming. Capcom's influence extends far beyond the Resident Evil series, shaping the DNA of numerous contemporary games. There is no Gears of War without Resident Evil, there is no The Last of Us without Resident Evil, there is no Outlast, Evil Within, no Dead Space. This game is the major reason most of these titles I mentioned even exist, and it came out in 1996. However, even a fan favorite franchise like Resident Evil faced challenges that nearly jeopardized its legacy. The bold decision to reboot the series after the 6th main game while it was selling millions upon millions of copies, choosing to go back to its roots instead of keep milking a cash cow that would eventually run out of any milk, was vital in avoiding a similar fate to Silent Hills, a video game series that was ahead of its time in the late 90s and early 2000s but fell from grace not being able to capitalize on their success and eventually failing to innovate during a new era. I personally think that the story of Resident Evil's rise, almost downfall, rise back to the roots while innovating, to now being in the Game of the Year awards talks is one that needs to be talked about. Now you pack your shit and get out of here first thing. I don't know why I said that. This video is much longer than my usual one, so sit back and enjoy because this one is a doozy. Back in the prehistorical days of 1996, Capcom just released their new game called Resident Evil, or Biohazard as known in Japan. It was a breath of fresh air and nothing like people have seen before. In a time with games like Street Fighter and Chrono Trigger around, survival horror games weren't prevalent at all, most of the times missing the horrific environments and atmosphere. There was Alone in the Dark, but come on, that's where it pretty much begins and ends. Inspired by Capcom's Sweet Home, Tokuro Fujiwara felt like the 3D era of gaming was advanced enough for them to take another stab at a believable horror game. Shinji Mikami was chosen to direct Resident Evil, which didn't make that much sense at the time because of his past work having absolutely no correlation to horror titles. I'm not gonna drop any spoilers, or at least not massive spoilers for these games, or if I do, you will be warned before I do so. Breaking down some of the basic core gameplay designs of Resident Evil 1 effectively breaks it down for pretty much all of the early entries because they've largely gone unchanged. I want to start off with the camera. Don't you dare ever disrespect the game's camera movement until you've played Resident Evil, but it's not all smoke and mirrors, so I'm gonna explain what it does right and wrong, compiled with the controls. Resident Evil 1's camera is the definition of making you feel like a CCTV camera. The fixed angles can become very confusing or play to some memorable horror moments. In a room you will swap between 5 different fucking angles, completely destroying your sense of direction. This looks preposterous. On the other hand, it helps massively in the atmosphere and scares. Sometimes you might hear an enemy close by but the camera won't show him. It can play to close by encounters with zombies, them just appearing in your line of sight after the angle switch. Resident Evil is also known for having what is known today as tank controls. When it comes to navigating with these controls, it gets pretty confusing. Usually in a game, the character's movement would be influenced also by the camera's position. This game says no. Even though you swap the camera angle a million times, the mechanic of going forward remains the same. By pressing the upper buttons on the controller, the character will go forward regardless if the camera angle makes sense. A lot of the times, what is left for you is right for your character, and what is forward for you is backwards for them. This leads to very clunky movement half of the time, bumping into walls 24/7. Wait, I said I'm gonna mention something good about it too. So with the help of this camera, the game allows itself to have pre-rendered environments, higher detail, and lower hardware resource cost, meaning that you're essentially just looking at a world compiled of pictures. It plays to its strengths instead of its weaknesses, because besides the fact that it helps massively at the horror aspect, it allows the developers to have complete control over what you're seeing, making for a more complete and better looking experience. I think the tank controls are very confusing, but by making them normal wouldn't fix shit either. You would have to readjust your button pressing like every 2 seconds, so even though it temporarily gets confusing in the beginning, it's actually the easier way in the long run. Now, the inventory space. The short version of it would be just bullshit, but the game has 2 protagonists that you can choose from to follow the campaigns in different POVs. You only have 8 inventory slots. Carrying a gun and a clip, magazine, are 1 slot each. Healing items take up 1 or more depending on how many you decide to carry. Essential items such as keys to unlock doors to progress in the game also take up space. It does play to a more survival horror aspect, but the amount of backtracking you have to do in this game is actually absurd. 8 slots just isn't enough at times. I forgot to mention something again. This only applies to Jill, because if you choose to play as Chris, that is 6 inventory slot. Gun, ammo, healing item, that's half of your inventory, and you don't even carry shit, which feels so unnecessarily punishing in a game like this. The exploration is heavily impacted by the backtracking because of the inventory. Resident Evil 1 takes the survival side very serious. Low ammo is more often than not the case. You would usually expect the game to supply you with ammo when zombies take more than half a dozen bullets to take down. This game is only giving you more reasons to avoid confronting anyone, but it also slows you down when having to come back in a previous area. You are forced to take down a lot of zombies, but also incentivized to hold on to your resources for obligatory bosses. In the newer Resident Evil games, saving progress can be done as many times as you want, but it doesn't apply to this one. Ink ribbons are used to save progress at the typewriters. They are a finite currency that, guess what, take up inventory space. And also guess what, if you don't have any ink ribbons in your inventory, you can't save the game. If you run out of them, you will have to play from an older save. Now, just imagine if on that save you have no healing items, low ammo, and health. Yeah, it does not get any more survival than that. I know I haven't mentioned the combat once until this point, but the reason being that it's pretty simplistic to begin with. With the tank controls and the fixed camera angle, it's always best to get a little further away from the enemy to a vantage point or a corner to stop and shoot. With bosses, it does get a little easier and more comfortable. The bigger the enemy, the bigger the hit zone gets, making it more enjoyable to just start lashing out rounds in them. We pretty much established the core pillar designs the game has to offer. I'm not gonna sit here and talk about exploring the mansion to progress, because it's just unnecessary and it kinda effectively breaks down the plot, and that's not my job to do right now. Now we can safely move on to the next title in the series, which is
Resident Evil 2.
After the successful release of Resident Evil 1, which sold really well and was rated highly by critics, Capcom were in a safe place to up their game. This time taking control of the legendary Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the developers wanted to switch up the playstyle a little, becoming a more action-based compared to the previous entry while still retaining its scary and survival nature. The first game opened up like this. Resident Evil 2 starts off guns blazing, showing the outbreak that happened in Resident Evil 1 reaching Raccoon City. This time around, the game makes you feel stronger with more ammo and weapon choices, but it doesn't make the game too easy per se. More ammo in this game meant more zombies to fight. In the first game, a room would usually contain about 4 zombies, and in this one it's normal to see an average of even 6. Resident Evil 2, in my opinion, is the better game. The graphical leap is very noticeable, looking overall scarier, but it's also a more polished and a game filled with more content. Even though it plays it a lot safer by being more linear and forgiving, the level design and structure are pretty fucking similar to Resident Evil 1, but nevertheless good. The only improvements or changes are that the ink ribbons are easier to find this time around. I should stop saying this time around though. You can tell the health state of your character by just looking at their body language instead of having to look in the inventory. But as I said, the basics remain the same. Move, shoot, solve puzzle, open door, progress. Resident Evil 2 is regarded by many as an even better game than the first one, and I agree, it did everything one did and most of the time is better.
Resident Evil.
Resident Evil 3 Nemesis came out in 1999 as a sequel to the second game, from the perspective of Jill again in Raccoon City shortly before Leon's and Claire's campaign start. At first, Resident Evil 3 wasn't supposed to be a main game in the franchise, only sort of a spin-off, but it does stand tall and confident as a main title and not a side chick. With even more action-based gameplay than Resident Evil 2, the game does suffer from less content because it wasn't meant to be much after all. The implementation of Nemesis adds a phenomenal twist to exploration and combat. Nemesis will pop out a lot and follow you. Also, damn this boy fast. He added a new layer of fear for players, but never felt like the game was being unfair to the fan base, because he could be knocked down from shooting him a bunch and actually would drop some items. Resident Evil 2 introduced better looking environments and enemies, and Resident Evil 3 continues that. While originally not being created as a main game, it puts its big boy shoes on most of the times. It is the more underwhelming one of the bunch, but this shit is still good. A good way to end the PS1 trilogy while Capcom was busy playing around with their next Resident Evil game that was gonna come out on the Dreamcast. While a part of Capcom's team worked on Resident Evil 3, the other part worked on their next-gen Code Veronica that came out in 2000. This game does deserve a longer analogy like the other ones, but for the sake of what I'm trying to get into, I'll just give you the spark notes for the next ones. And I'll skip over some other Resident Evil games due to not having much to discuss about. These two counterparts seem to not learn from each other. In Code Veronica, you even have to press a button to walk up the stairs, while Resident Evil 3 got rid of that, letting you roam more freely. This entry doesn't include ammo crafting and gore counters like Resident Evil 3, but it does some things better because it's a next-gen game. This time around you have 3D environments that play to a smoother experience. The camera angle doesn't just cut all the time like every 2 fucking seconds. It swoops behind the character and it follows him. And also, there is that. Resident Evil 0 does more of the same, so there's no reason to talk about it. At least I don't want to. There was the Resident Evil 1 remake in 2002 for the GameCube, but I decided to touch on it in the third chapter for more connectivity. The franchise was dearly beloved and even praised when it fell a step or two short, but there was a problem when comparing it to new and other mainstream games. It felt outdated. Something about this formula was starting to feel a little bit stale, so Capcom did the conscious decision of taking a leap of faith and remaking what a Resident Evil game is supposed to be. Resident Evil 4 is a certified hood classic and regarded by many as not only the series' best, but one of the best video games of all time period. The style chosen for this game is very different to say the least, departing heavily from the game's formula that Capcom created, further dropping the survival horror aspect in favor of a more fun action-based experience. It brings new mechanics to the franchise that have never been introduced before. From Resident Evil 4 up until now, the mechanics have remained similar, so I only have to explain them a lot for this one. Resident Evil 4 starts off very confident, recapping the events of Resident Evil 2 and how they scarred Leon for life. Now, him being a government agent with 6 years of training under his belt, he is tasked with finding the president's daughter somewhere in Spain. Now that we got the main plot out of the way, let's talk about the changes Capcom made.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
To start off with the most visible change in the design, the camera doesn't have fixed angles like before, adapting the over-the-shoulder camera view that largely influenced gaming sense. There is no more lock-on for enemies while in combat, instead of having this little red dot to use for aiming. While it does make it harder, at the same time adds more tension requiring for quicker reaction time from players. Jesus Christ man, this combat is so fucking good. It's easier to stagger enemies now. Shooting them in the leg or face will prompt up a Bruce Lee mechanic that is surprisingly fun. You can even take them to Suplex City now. This game really makes you feel like a demigod, or at least like a professional fighter now. I don't mind looking like John Jones. But now you can reload from the inventory, meaning that you gotta run a bunch away from the crowd to be able to reload. And yeah, you still have to stop and shoot. The enemies are a lot tougher now. They deal more damage and they usually like to crowd up together like it's a Travis Scott concert. But it does get satisfying when it happens because you can throw grenades under their asses. Pre-planning isn't important anymore because you have a very big arsenal at your disposal. The combat is more focused on your dexterity and speed. Ammo doesn't feel as precious anymore because Capcom really wants you to fight these enemies and experience their awesome combat. You're incentivized to go all Rainbow style. Dead enemies now drop anything from ammo to in-game currency that you can use to buy stuff from the merchant. The implementation of him couldn't have been done better. He's your best friend in your journey, upgrading or straight up buying new weapons or ammo or healing items or anything in this fucking world. Capcom really makes you feel like you just won the golden ticket and the merchant is Willy Wonka who's about to take you to his chocolate factory. That being an OLED shack or something. The inventory space has been fixed, becoming a lot larger. Saving the game is finally changed, throwing the ink ribbons out the window. No more inventory space taken, no more finite currency that you can run out of. Just save your progress as much as you want. Thank you, Capcom, fucking finally. But back to the camera for a moment. While I think it massively helps in a better gaming experience, it also fails in something. Atmosphere. The game sometimes zooms out the camera view so that you can notice the environment better. Also zooms in to make for a more claustrophobic side a little. But in my opinion, RE4's camera fails to have the same atmosphere like the older games had with the fixed camera angles. Environments were better analyzed and observed and definitely more memorable. That's not to say that Resident Evil 4's setting and look aren't good. They just don't quite reach the same level of the older ones. Capcom implemented QTEs for Resident Evil 4, which play a lot into combat sequences and gameplay scheme. They also upped their game regarding bosses with some actual hard ones. Resident Evil 4 includes a lot of secured arenas on the map where you gotta fight a horde of enemies. I haven't even talked about the graphical and production leap. This is so much better. But my favorite thing about the game are the corny lies and goofy villains. By this point everyone has had a laugh at characters like Salazar for being a very delusional guy.
I let our miserable insects out for some exercise down in the sewer.
The radio transmissions between Leon and the villains are so funny that you even forget at times that you'll have to fight them IRL, not just some off-camera beef, some internet beef. The delivery of Leon's lines is so epic.
Are you out of your mind?
I knew you'd be fine if you landed on your butt.
He always makes me feel like Capcom were inspired a little by Spider-Man. I know this is a weird analogy, but in my opinion it makes sense. The jokes are sometimes bad.
Sadler, you're small time.
Just like our little friendly neighborhood webheads.
The illegal weapons deal ferry was at 10:30. You missed it.
Keeping up the slate and roasting the characters as much as often as possible.
Don't you think this is a revolutionary way to promulgate one's faith?
Sounds more like an alien invasion if you ask me.
Just like Spider-Man, even in serious and threatening situations. Just like Spider-Man. Now, we're officially done with this game, and I hope some of you weren't worried that this chapter is dedicated just for Resident Evil 4, because I'm gonna touch on the next ones a little. The 2009 Resident Evil 5 is next in line as the main game in the series. And if I'm being honest, I really don't want to talk about it, because I just don't like it. Resident Evil 5 comes with more deviation from the original formula, looking more and more like an action shooting game than ever before. While the game had controversial opinions on it, it's not a bad game to begin with. But still, look at it. How is this a part of the franchise? If it was a different title in a different series, this would be good. But this is Resident Evil we're talking about at the end of the day. Despite harsh and divided opinions on it, that didn't stop it from becoming the highest selling Resident Evil game to date. Now moving on to Resident Evil 6, which continued the trend set by its predecessor. Released in 2012, when the whole world was supposed to go to shit but didn't happen, Resident Evil 6 took the series even further into an action genre. And if I'm being honest, Another installment I'm not eager to discuss. The game received a mix of reviews, with some praising its expansive storyline, multiple perspectives, and intense set pieces. However, for those who hold the traditional Resident Evil formula close to heart, Resident Evil 6 felt like a further departure from the series' roots. Like I said, these aren't bad games, but that shit ain't Resident Evil, man. Capcom expected Resident Evil 6 to outsell 5, and while it didn't do that, it sold really well, being one of their best-selling games at the time and now as well, but still behind 5. Irony. If they went down the path of continuing this reshaped formula of Resident Evil, they would have still got the bag, but I personally think that not for long. Also, losing your core fanbase should be a red flag for a company. After 2 underwhelming and heavily deviated releases, Capcom really needed to reach for the moon with their next release. The best move would have been to take a step back and analyze their situation to prevent a disastrous downfall of the series. But the situation Capcom was in was a tough one. On one side of the argument, they were reaching new selling points, but on the other side, this would have potentially made a core and big fan base to give up on them. But thankfully, Capcom made the choice to go against the odds, discontinuing what was bringing in more cash, in favor of what the fans wanted. So then they made Resident Evil.
Welcome to the family, son.
In 2016, Capcom released an early demo to the public for Resident Evil 7 and was like completely different from the previous games. A shift to a first-person view has never been performed in the series, with the developers wanting the experience to be as scary as possible to recapture what the earlier days of the franchise felt. But one thing it was missing completely was guns or any sort of combat. The demo had very little gameplay to be played, with us recording our way down with Shane and Ryan.
You almost scared me to death. I'm never gonna
or whatever the fuck these two are called. I don't know. I don't care. They just remind me of them. Many people agree that Capcom tried really hard at recreating what Konami did in 2014. It's such an obvious attempt to build some hype around the release, like how PT did. But Silent Hill is Silent Hill. This is Resident Evil. It really didn't look like a Resident Evil game that much. Nonetheless, Resident Evil 7 did not disappoint. The game really makes you feel uncomfortable even walking around in the main house, because the fear of something just spawning behind you or in front of you, or Jack just coming to swoop you and verbally abuse you,
Oh boy! Now look what you've done, motherfucker!
was always there. But it successfully comes back to the roots while innovating. The creepy environments such as the basement, which holy mother of God, I talked about him in this video. Like, comment, share. The Reach for the Moon engine built by Capcom is fantastic, making the technical jump from what was before massive, placing you in the shoes of Ethan Winters, an average man that is severely underprepared for what's about to come his way, but still manages to learn and evolve, becoming the baddest motherfucker alive, at least in this game. Copy and pasted mole monsters that are extremely similar to the RE4 regenerators, so I guess that's a point deducted for Resident Evil 7. And how could I forget about the villains? The background of the Baker family slowly unraveled as you go on, also helped by notes left around, like Lucas's that recites that time when he was taken to the mental hospital, you know, because he's fucking nuts. Marguerite, while not being in my opinion as memorable as the other two, still decent, and doesn't disappoint in making me feel disgusted when I look at her. The creepy stalker and sort of hilarious Jack Baker that follows you around, and he does it with style. He's got this odd hillbilly attitude and likes to trash talk a lot, which creates a funny bullying dynamic between him and Ethan. I crave for more non-cutscene interactions like these, because he was so effective in surprising me while also annoying me more than even a game like Elden Ring, which I didn't know it's possible.
Oh fuck you! But what the fuck? What the fuck? Bro, nah, fuck you. Fuck this shit.
And while this game does kinda break the immersion at times and adds a bullshit connected ending to the past games, well, for the whole of it, Umbrella or anything else weren't even mentioned, even with those problems, is still an outstanding experience. Resident Evil 7 truly deserves a video of its own, and there are a lot of videos on this website that can satisfy that need. Many videos made on this game are about how Resident Evil 7 saved the franchise or some stuff like that, and I kinda have to agree, but technically it didn't really do it. Resident Evil 5 and 6 sold extremely well, even on par with this one. Resident Evil 7 was in fact the best thing that could have happened to the franchise, rebooting it completely. The expectations were exceeded and saved the soul of the franchise. It enjoyed good ratings from the fans and critics, sold really well, and put Resident Evil back on the map where it belongs. But Capcom was ready for some more smoke.
Attention all citizens. You are advised to take shelter at the Raccoon City Police Station.
You don't understand. The situation's worse than I thought.
In 2019, they unleashed the remake of Resident Evil 2, a monumental achievement that set the gold standard for remaking video games. The Reach for the Moon engine showed a better version of Raccoon City, capturing the essence of the original while adding layers of fear and tension. Leon and Claire, now rendered with realistic visuals, navigated throughout the hunting locales, and the relentless pursuit of Mr. X turned every corner into a heart-pounding experience. Just hearing this made our palms sweat a little. Don't you lie, it did. One thing I've saved to mention is the Resident Evil 1 remake. I think this is the best time to bring it up. After the release of Resident Evil 3, people had some stuff to say like, where's Resident Evil 1 remake? Why did they skip over Resident Evil 1 remake? We need Resident Evil 1 remake. But I don't think people get it. Capcom haven't skipped over it. This is not a remaster, this is a remake. The OG came out in 1996, this is in 2002. Just look at the difference. Look at it again. Again, and one more time. While it didn't really bring anything new other than having to burn zombies so that they wouldn't come back at one point with Usain Bolt ambitions, it's still a remake. They effectively utilized the strength of the 3D environments to remake this game into a new standard for graphics at the time. And this was on the Nintendo GameCube, not the PlayStation 2, not the Xbox, which I think is extremely impressive. Fast forward a few years, Capcom have truly mastered the Reach for the Moon engine, with their games looking better and better and masterpiece after masterpiece. Wait, I gotta criticize something. It's my job, huh? Resident Evil 3 is pretty mid, that being because of the standards 2 set. Everything 3 did, 2 did already and better. While the graphics and controls remain top notch, the removal of certain locations and narrative choices left a void for those who cherish the original. The iconic nemesis didn't quite instill the same fear as Mr. X did. I believe his implementation was dog shit, excuse my language kids, but he was handled so poorly. He doesn't chase you around anymore, he just pops out like Polo G.
Pop out at your party.
And he's usually introduced by a cutscene, and he sticks around for a couple of minutes to make your progression feel a little harder. But Resident Evil 8 now, that one is a lot better. It's not one of my favorites from the Reach for the Moon engine era, but still a good one. The game looks beautiful, displaying the power of the RE engine way better than 2 and 3 did, in my opinion. The locations were pretty unique for Resident Evil, in my opinion. Again, the game was filled with action and scares and chases. We all know the sole reason why we all talked about it so much when it came out. I even had non-gamer buddies know about this reason, and why you couldn't escape it. Lady Dimitrescu, nothing to say really, known as Lady D. I guess she really be putting that D in the hydration because my mouth was all dried up from my jaw hanging in disbelief when looking at her. But nah, for real though, she's fucking hot. Otherwise, she wouldn't be on
has to.
Sure your boys didn't come all the way out here to roast marshmallows.
Yeah, fat chance, Ramon. Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Resident Evil 4 Remake is everything that I love about Resident Evil, and gaming in general. Just remembering this makes you want to play it, but I'll do it after I do this thing. While it still suffers from something called cut content, similar to Resident Evil 3 Remake, it's not to the point of ruining it, and usually likes to add some more stuff to recompensate. Yeah, it doesn't have some boss fights or QTEs, and the reason being why you don't have QTEs anymore, the reason being as simple as they're not popular in today's time anymore. But regardless, the game is still Capcom's best ever release. That's my opinion. Ashley doesn't feel like a little kid that you need to waste 1 billion bullets to protect, and even then she'll get captured because she's stupid. The combat is sweet as hell, you know, like me, sweet. Knives in this game are finally useful, pairing is highly recommended, and it totally changes combat, being easily Leon's most versatile weapon choice. If this is what Capcom are able to do year after year, just imagine how the Resident Evil franchise will look in 10 years. Hopefully this is not a cycle and we don't get to the Resident Evil 5 and 6 situation anymore. I truly envy the people that got to play the older games like Resident Evil 0 and 4, or even older like 1 and 2, because they have truly shaped gaming. And Capcom know what the fuck they're doing, that's for sure. Not just cashing in on nostalgia, they're reimagining the classics for today's gamers. It's like they're saying, hey, we know you love the old stuff, but check out what we can do now. They are more than just games, they're a love letter to the franchise and its dedicated community. With the promise of more to come, the future of Resident Evil looks as promising as the dark corridors of the Spencer Mansion. So, as we eagerly anticipate the next Resident Evil from Capcom, one thing is certain: Resident Evil isn't just surviving, it's thriving. Thank you for watching my video, and I'll see you next time. Fucking hell, my back hurts.